We have 1 week to do this amazing backyard renovation. We have a deck, railing, turf, palapa, an outdoor kitchen, and we only have 1 week to do it. Can we? Let's find out. This video is all about how to prep and pour concrete footings for a deck, but in a grander scheme of things, this is also going to showcase how you and a few handy friends can actually take on a home remodeling project yourself in just a week and completely transform your entire space. This house is right next to the water, and to make it more of a usable space, we're going to be putting on a 50-foot long deck. So Pat and I just got a bit of a jump start today because number one priority for a project like this is to make sure we have a good quality foundation. And for that, we need to put concrete footings in place prior to actually having the deck installed. So that's what we're doing now. We just finished some demo. Now it's time for layout and footings. I placed a stake 10 feet away from the concrete ledge and then ran a string line across the entire property in order to easily determine exactly where each footing needs to be located. Depending on where you live, concrete footings could look very different. On some projects in the past that I've done, I've had to drill 2 feet deep in order to pour concrete sonotubes, which I will provide a link for in the description box below. But on this project, we are in Florida, not in the Pacific Northwest, and therefore the concrete footings look very different. And that's because we don't have a frost line we need to worry about here in Florida, but we do need to still make sure we have a proper foundation to spread out that weight evenly. The only problem is that we ran into an issue. Kind of a big issue because there are stumps right in line with where our footings need to be placed, and unfortunately we can't get any type of large equipment in the back here to try and remove it, but luckily for us we have plenty of shovels. The only thing is that there's only a few of us here today, and that means it's gonna get sweaty. I quickly fabricate a 2-foot by 2-foot box using 2x12s, and this is a perfect size footing for the type of deck that we're building, especially in areas where you don't have a frost line as we discussed earlier. I mark out footing locations with some standard striping paint, and the footings are placed at the very ends on both sides, but the space in between those are 12 feet apart, and that is 12 feet apart from center to center. I'm in the process of engineering some architectural plans for this deck, so if you're interested in actually building this for yourself, then please check out the link in the description box below, because if it's not there now, it will be shortly. And as we begin the shoveling process, keep in mind that you should call 811 before you dig, especially if you're in the United States, because that is a service that comes out for free, and it determines if there's actually any plumbing or piping involved in this area, which there obviously was, just a couple inches down luckily, and we were easily able to remove it because it was just a small water line, but it could be something more significant on your project. Once your footing box is at the correct depth, I place a level on it and then secure it in place by pounding a few wood stakes on all sides and then screwing a few fasteners into the framework. In most instances, I would actually take a laser level and make sure the height of our footings were actually the same height all the way across. But in this circumstance, because we have such an insane root system in this beach, the digging process took forever. This process should literally take just a few hours. However, 9 hours later, we were still digging, and that's because the root system was so difficult to get through. However, luckily for me, Pat actually came up with an ingenious idea where we actually got the formwork as far down as possible and then used the box as leverage to dig down even deeper. It really did make it easier to dig with the boxes in place and then dig into the sub area underneath it. Once we had proper depth, I tamped down the dirt and then moved on to the next one. And you might be asking yourself, how are you actually determining the proper depth? Well, this is where a laser level still comes into play, because by setting up a laser on top of our patio and using this leveling rod, which has numbers all the way down it, we actually are able to pinpoint exactly where the height needs to be for each individual concrete footing across all sections, even if the tops of our forms are not the same exact height. I fit snugly in every single form box and make a line at the very bottom of the rod as Pat lines up the level above him. As you can imagine, this was an exhausting first day, but we still had a sense of humor even at the very end of the day. Oh, we've got huge senses of humor because we are still digging forms while it's late out and it's dark. But you know what? That's what we have to do when we have concrete coming in the mornings.
That's what construction's all about, baby. It's about getting it done.
That's right, Pat.
Get her done.
That's right.
That's construction.
Woo! You really do need to roll with the punches sometimes, especially in construction, and as you can see, we took care of all those forms even late at night. But we still need to take care of a few items before the concrete gets here, and luckily, our rock just arrived. And it does come with some sand, but the sand is going to be for some turf that we're going to be doing later on this project. But for now, our large crushed rock is going to be what we're using at the very base of our concrete footings. You want to pour at least 3 to 4 inches of crushed rock under your concrete formwork because you want water to properly drain underneath your concrete, and if you don't have this, then there might be some slight movements down the road. I spread out the rock evenly with a rake, and once that's taken care of, I then tamp it down in place. Make sure you tamp it down because you want a nice stiff base before you add your rebar. You do want to double check your depth because you still want to guarantee that you have at least 1 foot of concrete. I move on to the next one and do the same exact thing, and then the next one and the next one. As you can see, there's 2 rows of footings. One is centered at 10 feet and the other one is centered at 14 feet and 4 inches. Now on your project, you might not have to do 2 rows, but since we have a stairwell and a diagonal shape on this deck, we need a second row. Our footings are ready to go. The real concept of this is that we dug it down and we used a laser level net last night to determine the exact height needed at every single corner. So the concrete actually doesn't have to go all the way up to the top of our framing, and therefore it makes it a lot easier to dig down into our footings but still have the proper depth for concrete. Now we just have to wait for concrete, and guess what? It just arrived. Luckily for us on this project, we were also able to get a concrete pump, which is going to make our life much easier to get the concrete to the backyard. But while they're getting all that set up, Pat and I cut and placed our rebar into our formwork. The application of rebar with these footings is very straightforward. Each piece is cut at 22 inches, and then I'm using rebar ties at every single corner so it becomes one fluid piece. Once all 4 corners are taken care of, I then place the rebar into our formwork, but we do need to prop it up, and that's where these cute little rebar chairs come into play. I place one at every single corner, and that just raises up the rebar so the concrete can get underneath it. We get all the rebar done just in time in order for our concrete to start pumping into our formwork. This is quite a satisfying portion of this project because it's so simple to get the concrete in after we know all the hard work that was done to just get these forms ready to go. As we're pouring, we're very diligent about checking the height as we go to make sure that we're not overfilling any of these forms. The only key element that I'd like to suggest at this point is to make sure you double and triple check the amount of concrete needed for a project like this, and I'll also leave a concrete calculator in the description box below, which makes calculating very straightforward. A concrete vibrator isn't something you have to have on a project like this, but it quickly and effectively reduces many of the air bubbles and levels out the concrete very nicely. While the remaining footings are poured, Pat and I determine exactly where our center point is going to be for our hardware. As noted earlier, our support beam should be centered at 10 feet, and therefore we strike a line exactly where that needs to be placed, and then move it over a couple inches, where we can run a string line all the way across, which makes it very easy to line up all of our brackets evenly. As for hardware, we're using adjustable post-base brackets by Simpson Strong Tie. These brackets come with a J-hook that's placed at the very bottom, and you can get ones that actually have a fixed J-hook at the bottom, which would have also worked in this application, but it's always nice to have something that can be slightly adjusted one way or the other after the concrete is dry. I move on to the next bracket, just making sure that the back side of that bracket lines up nicely with the string line that's going all the way across the yard. And after I have all the brackets installed, we need to wait for those to actually fully set and dry overnight. So while we wait, let's get to our ledger board. Most ledger boards will be attached directly to your house, and I do have a video for that if you're in so need of a tutorial for that type of application. But in this circumstance, we're going to be attaching it to the concrete substrate of our patio. This of course involves a little bit of demo along with some grinding because the substrate is not perfectly flat. In order to smooth out this surface quickly, I'm using a grinder with a diamond cup wheel. Just make sure that you're wearing a proper respirator, eye protection, and some ear protection when you're doing this. As we start day 3 of this project, it really is nice, 1, because we have proper concrete footings, and 2, we have some helping hands to join us in all the fun. Meet Nolan and Scott, who were huge helps on this project, and the first task at hand were to actually tighten down all of our brackets as well as getting all of our posts lined up. Once the J-bolt is properly tightened on these brackets, you then place a top cap right over it, and that way our 6x6 posts have a perfect surface to lay upon.
So this is a very exciting step right now because we are finally getting to lumber and inserting our very first post into our post bracket. Now we're setting these up, making sure that they're perfectly level all the way down, while we're also making sure that we're attaching our ledger board. And once our ledger board is attached, we'll use our laser to determine exactly the right height that we need to cut every single one of these posts. Easy enough in theory.
As we finish up our post install, we can move on to our ledger board. But for this install, we need to use some spacers that are specifically designed for ledger boards. These are called deck to wall spacers, and it actually goes onto the back side of your ledger board. The spacers are applied in a continuous W style pattern, and of course 2 on the ends. And if you're wondering why we're installing this product, here's why.
The ledger board is one of the most important parts of the deck because this is actually attaching to an existing structure. Sometimes it's attached to your home, which is why we use Z flashing, but in this case, because we're attaching it to a concrete structure, we're going to be using these spacers behind the ledger board so moisture doesn't get trapped behind it and then potentially rot our ledger board. So let's get it installed.
Let's get to work, boys. Let's get to work, boys.
Prior to installing our ledger board, we have to pre-drill all of our holes, which is actually very easy because all we have to do is take a drill bit and drill straight through the center of our deck to wall spacers. By this time of the day, we had even more help on our hands with Christy, Omar, and Nick. They helped a great deal with installing this massive ledger board because it took a lot of energy just to drill all of these holes into our concrete. We're using a large hammer drill with a long masonry bit to get as deep as possible for these anchor bolts. The fasteners that we're using for this application are actually called out as concrete anchor screws because you're actually screwing them into position. And these are specifically designed for concrete because they have a very sharp thread that digs into your concrete as you're securing them in place. If you're wondering how we determine the exact position of this ledger board, keep in mind that there's a blue line at the very bottom of this ledger board, as you can see right here. And that's because we placed a mark on both sides of this ledge and then took a chalk line and snapped it at the very bottom. And that provides a perfect line for our installation as we're going down the space.
Ledger board in full effect. Woo!
This ledger board really did take a lot of time and energy to get installed properly and level, but it's so vital to this entire project, which is why we took our time to do so. Now that we have our ledger board in and our posts in, it's time to cut our post to the proper height. In order to determine the correct height for our post, it's fairly simple. All I had to do is place my laser level on the very top of our ledger board and then transfer that line to our post. Now that our post is marked, Pat grabs a circular saw and cuts all 4 sides evenly. But before you cut any more, you want to double check and make sure that this is the proper height and level with the entire structure. And believe it or not, we nailed the elevation perfectly the very first time, and as you can see, Brent was a little excited.
Oh, baby.
You're missing this moment.
Can you do that again?
That's the best feeling ever.
Oh, yeah.
Right there. Best feeling ever.
100%.
I really was extremely excited at that moment because the fact that Pat could get to work on cutting the rest of those posts and we could start installing our beam. The beam itself is just made up of standard 2x12s, but we have 3 layers with staggered seams in order to have a correct and secure span all the way across from post to post. It's basically just a large glue lamb that we're nailing in place in this circumstance. We're using 3-inch long galvanized nails on both sides in a W pattern formation, and once we have the beam together, we can nail it to our posts. We just need to make sure that the post is level before we nail it. Keep in mind that when we're installing this beam, the majority of the seams are landing right in the dead center of the post, and that's what you want because the majority of the load of this deck is going to be placed on this beam that also is going to transfer down into the post and then of course our footings. And if the majority of the seams are not placed directly over the top of our posts, then there could be a failure down the road. As you're watching this video, you might recognize a few of the individuals that I'm working with, and that's because every single one that's working on this project is a content creator, and I'll be providing links in the description box below if you want to give a follow. And that includes all the individuals that worked on this project, not just the ones that were featured in this video. We all worked extremely hard on this project, and if you want to see how this beautiful, sexy beast turns out, and if we can get it done within a week, well, make sure you follow and subscribe for next week's video.